All right, everyone, can you hear me? So people should slowly settle in. There's more space over here. If someone can find a seat, this corner is pretty empty. If people want to snuck in here before we get started. Cool. Good. Okay, so welcome everyone to the afternoon session. It's my huge honor and pleasure to welcome Jay McClelland as our next keynote speaker for the afternoon session. Jay McClelland is the Lucy Stern Professor and Director at the Center for Mind-Brain Computation and Technology at Stanford University, and he's also a consulting scientist at DeepMind. And there's probably a few people out there who need as less of an introduction as Jay does, because I think he's very well known. And he's most well known for putting out the idea, or being one of the founding fathers of the idea, that cognition arises from parallel and distributed processing. And I think we can all agree that this idea is more alive and well than ever. And particularly impressive is that in addition to just planting these seeds, he's kind of shown how to use that idea in specific use cases, and that has deeply shaped our understanding of semantic processing, of how different memory systems interact with each other, but also of mathematical cognition. So we are very excited to welcome him here and having him speak today to us. I'm briefly going to say that he has won many awards and many recognitions for his contributions to the field, but there are too many to mention, and I don't want to take more away of his time, and just ask you to join me in welcoming Jay McClelland.
Thank you. Take a deep breath while the flow still continues here and people grab their seats. So, for the last few years, I've been asking myself this question: are people still smarter than machines? In the late 70s and 80s, it seemed to many people that people were smarter than the good old AI systems that we had at that time. Many people thought this. And in the PDP group at UCSD, we discussed the limitations of these old AI systems, and we proposed parallel distributed processing models based on artificial neural networks as an alternative. The networks we developed based on these ideas generated a lot of interest, but they didn't result in performant AI systems at the time. And during the first decade of the 2000s, they were hardly mentioned in computer science departments, and by the end of that decade, many had rejected them in favor of probabilistic symbolic models, like those of Tenenbaum and his colleagues from that decade, which they summarized nicely in a paper in 2011. But today's deep learning models have taken AI by storm. They use billions times the data and compute, and they exploit new architectural and other key developments. Yet these models are built on the principles we articulated in PDP, and they extend them to capture many of the phenomena that motivated the framework. So I just want to highlight what to me are the key computational and brain-inspired principles of parallel distributed processing. Processing occurs via propagation of graded activation signals among simple processing units. Representations are distributed patterns of activation across these units. The knowledge in the system is in the connections, and learning occurs through adjusting connections to optimize an objective function. Now, that last one has always been a challenge in the intersection of neuroscience and computational science, It was Jeff Hinton's key contribution to our group to bring this idea forward, and Rumelhart seized on it and developed backpropagation after he got this idea from a computer scientist. So it's always been an interesting mixture of brain-inspired and computationally inspired ideas. And in fact, Jeff once said, you know, if you multiply the biological plausibility of your model times its computational efficiency, that's just going to be a constant. So the less you worry about the biology, the better you'll do on the computational side. That was a joke, of course. He doesn't quite believe that. He's brain-inspired too, in his own special way. So, in some ways, systems using these principles are pretty smart, right? They function well enough to be in use every day for speech recognition, language translation, and many other things. They exceed human performance in games like Go and chess, and they're getting more and more powerful every day. So it may seem that AI has begun to exceed human cognitive abilities. How about large language models? Are they on the verge of capturing intelligence? Well, this is what Sam Altman had to say, the CEO of OpenAI, on the day that GPT-3 was released in November of last year. He said, language interfaces are going to be a big deal, I think. Talk to the computer, voice or text, and get what you want for increasingly complex definitions of want. This is an early demo of what's possible, still a lot of limitations. It's very much a research release. Soon you'll be able to have helpful assistants that talk to you, answer questions, and give advice. Later you can have something that goes off and does tasks for you. Eventually you can have something that goes off and discovers new knowledge for you. But this same interface works for all of that. This is something that sci-fi really got right. Until we get neural interfaces, language interfaces are probably the next best thing. So this guy seems like a bit of a cut-up to me, and he obviously is a master of hyping his own products. But he's partially right about some of these things, or so many of us think, while others think, no, that's all completely wrong. It can't possibly be like that. So what's the approach that's being taken here, and how does it work? You train a huge decoder-only transformer with as many weights as possible and as much text as possible for as long as possible. But there's an alignment problem. Next word prediction, which is all these things are doing, is not the same as doing what we want. And so they worked on that, right? They recognized that problem, and they started doing things like InstructGPT and ChatGPT, where they fine-tuned the model to be more than just a next word prediction engine. But models based on them still have a long way to go, as OpenAI acknowledges. So I want to be inclusive today, and I want to share my way of understanding the core of these models with everyone here, so we're on the same page as we think about their limitations. But let's think about what they actually are first, and at least my way of thinking about that. So what I've tried to do here is to distill what I think of as the essence of query-based attention, or key-value-based attention, or transformer-based attention, however you want to call it. In this version, we're doing something that's used in some models, but not most of them, where there's just one vector that's in a sort of a list of many vectors. It's both the key that we use to find something that matches a query and the thing that we get back when we retrieve something that matches our query. And we think of, in this context, we think of the query as being maybe a subset of the elements of one of these representation vectors. So this was the approach used in the differentiable neural computer for memory retrieval, okay? And the standard large language model variant is a little different, but we'll get to that shortly. So I'm imagining here that someone has heard someone say, John hit the ball with the, and then the word bat appears. And they want to understand, should I think of this as a flying animal or as a baseball bat? Cricket bat, maybe, I don't know. So the word bat sends off a query across the context, and wherever it has a positive dot product with items in the context, you get some similarity, and I'm showing the strongest positive dot product here with the verb hit, and a little bit of a positive dot product with. In this case, it doesn't really, this query doesn't match too many of the other things. So based on these similarities in the portion that the query probes, we get weights. The weights are just a softmax over these similarities, right? So the strongest similarity gets most of the weight. And so we then get this scaled representation vector, and we add up all the rep vectors scaled by their weights, and we get the weighted attention vector. And that's what query-based attention does. It gets a weighted attention vector back from a query, just like that. And this is something which, on the one hand, seems like a profound innovation, but on the other hand, it's a very familiar model to many of us. And Hopfield had a model, which is not the original Hopfield network, it's the modern Hopfield network, that they called dense associative memory, but somebody decided that Hopfield deserved it to be named after him, so it's now called the modern Hopfield net, which essentially is the same idea. You have many, many vectors in memory, and you have a query, you do pattern completion with that query based on the goodness of match between the query and the items in memory, and you retrieve a blend of memory states. This was Doug Hintzman's Minerva model from 1984, and something that showed up in many of my early papers in a slightly different form as well. So in some sense, this is an old idea, but by embedding it in the language model, we've gained a huge amount of additional leverage in ways that nobody anticipated, and certainly wasn't how we thought about the role of this kind of model when it was first described. So nowadays, this computation is used massively and repeatedly in these transformer models. So what I'm trying to do here on this slide is to give you my sort of visualization of the way these systems work. First of all, on the left, you see several slots from a stream of text. Might be the words that we just saw, John hit the ball with the, and now the next word is bat coming in, and it comes in, it reaches this module called a multi-head attention module, and from there, it goes forward to a good old-fashioned feed-forward neural network. But what exactly is going on in that multi-head attention module? Pretty much the computation I just described. At each position, you form a query. There's a set of connection weights that map an input representation into a query vector, and that is compared to the keys for all the context. The dot product of the query and the keys is weighted based on the dot product, and then you get this blend over the value vectors of all the items previously in the context. So now the keys and the values are separate vectors, but it's pretty much the same idea. So in BERT, the context extends in both directions from the current input position. You get like 256 words at the same time, and you do this massively parallel constraint satisfaction process, allowing each position in 256 of those positions to query each other and allow each other to decide what the best way of representing each of those words in that set of vectors really would be, right? That is parallel distributed processing beyond my wildest dreams. And it's happening at up to 96 heads, at up to 96 levels of this transformer, and it's just huge. Is our brain actually capable of that? I actually think maybe not, at least not 256 of them, all in parallel, all at once. So I think this is exploiting parallel distributed processing, though, in a way that, I think Rumelhart would have really liked, because he really believed that everything constrained everything else in a bidirectional kind of way. He wrote this beautiful paper called An Interactive Model of Reading, where he articulated that idea, and that was part of why I sort of started thinking these ideas were really exciting myself. GPT only uses the preceding context, right? So it's really just this item querying all the previous ones, and they're sort of sitting there static now, but you can have a huge number of them. So to help visualize this, GPT-3 had up to 4,000 tokens worth of text input and up to 96 layers deep, so that, the querying that's going on that is determining the input to that top corner node where the output is going to be generated is able to span this huge trailing window of space across this entire window. GPT-4, they tell us it's got up to 12,000 plus tokens in its context. And we don't really know what the architecture is anymore. They're not really telling us that. Like, many people believe there is no single neural network in there. There's just a whole bunch of them working together. But it's all, speculation and conversations over coffee with people who aren't allowed to speak because they've signed an NDA. So, what's up with that? Anyway, I just want to mention the fine-tuning part. It's part of the context of what I'm going to say later. After you've trained this model with this huge, huge corpus, long context, predicting the next word, you freeze the connection weights, or you save the connection weights from that, and then you fine-tune it. So you give it inputs and look at what people generate as their responses to those inputs. And for example, this is from their blog. Explain reinforcement learning to a 6-year-old. A labeler demonstrates the desired output. We give treats and punishments to teach the child blah, blah, blah. This data is used to fine-tune GPT 3.5 with supervised learning. So that's SFT. But then they collect outputs from the model and they compare them to this human-generated stuff, and they get people to vote for which one they think is better, and they train a model to imitate the human judgments of which one is better, and then they use that model to further train GPT-3. So it's learned to imitate human evaluation and then use that to give rewards and punishments, like in the explanation to the child. Okay? So that's the fine-tuning scheme. So let me give you a couple conversations with GPT-4. I thought GPT-3 was pretty cool, but when I first saw GPT-4, before. It sort of knocked my socks off. It solved this calculus problem, and it described its solution process really, really well. And it's not perhaps a problem that a good calculus student shouldn't be able to solve, but it's a little bit complicated. What is the derivative of the function x squared over c squared all over the quantity 1 plus x squared over c squared with respect to x? So I'm not going to read through all of this, but I've read through it many times. I haven't found an error in this one. I'm going to just highlight a couple of things. The first thing is it gives us an overview of the solution strategy. To find the derivative of this function with respect to x, we can first simplify the function by substituting u equals x squared over c squared. So f of u equals u over 1 plus u. Oh, that's pretty simple. Then we can find the derivative with respect to u and finally substitute back to find the derivative with respect to x. Okay, so it goes on. It breaks this apart and goes through a whole bunch of steps. And then, it tells us, tells us what rules it's going to apply. So it uses the quotient rule to get the derivative of f of u, and then it uses the chain rule when it's going to get the derivative with respect to x, and goes through a variety of steps, including algebraic manipulation, and then shows us the answer, and seems beautiful. However, it's not always perfect. So let's go through an example of reasoning about grids. This part impressed me. Can you define the concept of diagonal adjacency to me? Diagonal adjacency refers to the relationship between two cells in a grid that are next to each other along a diagonal line. In other words, two cells are diagonally adjacent if they share a common corner but do not share any edges. Okay. So can you place one x in each row and column of a 4x4 grid without any of the x's being adjacent, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally? Yes, it's possible to place one x in each row and column of a 4x4 grid, blah, blah, blah. Here's one possible solution. In this arrangement, none of the x's are adjacent in any direction, meeting the specified conditions. I looked at this for a while, and then I said, wait, your grid seems to have diagonally adjacent x's in the second and third rows. Do you agree? Apologies for my mistake. You're correct. My previous example does have diagonally adjacent x's in the second and third rows. Unfortunately, it is not possible to place x's in a 4x4 grid without any of them being adjacent, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. It's not true. There it is. Of course, if you imagined it wrapped around, then it wouldn't work, but it does if you don't imagine that. So, these are limitations from OpenAI with one elaboration from me. ChatGPT sometimes writes plausible sounding but incorrect or nonsensical answers and can express great confidence in a completely nonsensical answer. It's sensitive to tweaks in the input phrasing. Given one phrasing, it seems like it knows the answer, but given a slightly different one, it gets it wrong. I said that backwards from the way I wrote it, but you get the idea. Ideally, the model would ask clarifying questions. Instead, the current models usually guess what the user intends. So, is the way ahead just a matter of scaling up? Back in the end of the 19th century, people were flying across the English channels in hot air balloons, and this seemed like a very productive way of optimizing travel and advancing people's ability to get from place to place quickly. And many people believed this was the only possible way to travel by air, right? You needed to create something that was lighter than air in order to succeed. And so, we often get into this habit of thinking that what we currently understand is something that's going to be the answer, and we should just kind of keep optimizing it. But in this case, that led to a catastrophe, which was the explosion of the Hindenburg, which was a transatlantic helium-filled blimp in the 1930s. So maybe we need something a little different. And I want to attribute this example to Dilip George, who is an interesting computational intelligence researcher who has been pursuing these ideas for many, many years as well. So I'm going to start talking now about the title of my talk, Capturing Intelligence at the Level of Thought. And I'm going to just give you the overview of my thinking about this at the outset, and then we're going to talk about some examples, and that way you can think along with me and argue along with me and think whether the models are already doing these things or not, and we'll come back to some of those themes as we go along. So the thesis here is that cognition, communication, goal-directed action, and learning all occur at the level of thought. Maybe not exclusively, but they do occur at that level. Introspecting on my own experience, it seems I'm often having, expressing, or understanding thoughts expressed by others. So here's an example. In an email I received yesterday, I heard that I was scheduled to talk at 3 p.m. BST. They told me I could bring my laptop with my presentation on it and directly plug it in at the podium. And I was asked to come at least 20 minutes early before the scheduled time so that we can make sure everything runs smoothly. And I did. I showed up at 2:36. So while activation vectors, all those things that are going on in query-based attention, are the substrate, our experience is at the level of thought. So what I'm trying to do is to understand thoughts as massively distributed states in systems that might be like LLMs, even though these systems may not yet capture the thought level sufficiently. So it might be a whole nother architecture, but still there's something about it that's worth exploring and thinking about as we go along. Okay. We think at the thought level, communicate with each other at the thought level, formulate goals and think about how to achieve them at the thought level, tell each other how we can achieve them at the thought level, describe how or why we've succeeded or failed at the thought level. What we ordinarily mean by learning involves updating our stored repository of thoughts. So not that long ago, I had the thought in my mind, which you could easily probe if you asked me, that the monarch of the United Kingdom was Queen Elizabeth. But she passed away, and I updated that representation, and now I know that the monarch is King Charles. Previously, I thought of him as Prince Charles, and I once knew of him as a very young boy when I was a child in England myself, but now I know of him as a self-important looking old man wearing a business suit. These are all thoughts, right? So I'm trying to suggest that we will create effective intelligence systems faster if we can design and train them to operate at the level of thought. It's not quite what's really happening right now. So one part of the response to this, and this is somewhat like what is beginning to happen right now, to bring these neural networks up within the cultural context of advanced academic and technical practices. I had trouble wording this phrase here. I'll tell you why in a second. This may be an important vehicle through which this process is set in motion. I used to think of it basically like once you went to school, in a structured education system of the kind that was developed in places like Oxford and Cambridge and propagated all over the world and has now become established universally in almost every country everywhere, you would be inculcated in a set of ways of thinking that come from being educated in that educational system. And I still think that that's true. But I think it goes beyond that, in that once your parents and your peers have been educated in those kinds of settings as well, it creeps into your earliest experiences. When I was a baby, my mother was an undergraduate at Radcliffe College, and she read Aristotle to me to keep me quiet. And I don't know, but that could be the reason why I've always been interested in thinking and things like that. I certainly believe that that cultural context, starting at an early age, is able to have a profound impact, just the same way that Mozart, being born as the fourth member of the string quartet, allowed him to become a child composer at the age of 5. So, new architectures and objective functions are likely to be needed too, and we should encourage their exploration, but this is part of it. Okay, so what is a thought? I've sort of hinted at this a little. It centers on something, right? The monarch of the United Kingdom, maybe. Here's an example that I sometimes think about. John picked an apple and gave it to Mary. It sounds very straightforward, and it has the properties that I'm looking for to an extent, right? It mentions a few key participants and relationships among them, and a change that occurs as a part of this sort of event that's described here. So John picked an apple and gave it to Mary. And you can think of this as being something that happened in the real world, okay? But we have to recognize that we're always picking out aspects of situations and the objects that are participating in them and construing them in relation to each other in particular ways. There is no single way of describing that event of John picking that apple. So the thought is definitely a construal that selects and connects entities through relations. And these entities and situations can be real or imaginary. They don't have to be real ones. And they can rely on human-constructed conventions that we're all expected to know and adhere to. So I'm scheduled to talk at 3 p.m. Please arrive 20 minutes early. I need to know that that should be in the local time, and I need to have a clock that tells me what the local time is, etc., right? And these conventions are not just like universal. They're things that structure our thought and give us extra tools that allow us to be more precise and goal-directed thinkers. But thoughts are tips of icebergs and interlocking pieces of a web of knowledge. So with that example, when John picked the apple, the branch probably shook, and there might have been possibly another apple that fell to the ground. And we might even have thought a bit about that, or we might have thought about the possibility that Mary's boyfriend was watching. And when John gave Mary the apple, we might have sort of begun to think that some situation might be going on here that wasn't explicitly mentioned that could present an interesting challenge for the future relationship among all the participants involved. And these things are maybe not in all of your consciousness after you read that sentence, but they're easily accessible from it. And Herb Clark's work, where he showed people things like John opened the trunk of the car. The beer was warm. People figure out, oh, the beer must have been in the trunk and it got warm because it was in the trunk of the car, right? So just mentioning the trunk of the car and the beer, it's sort of like, how am I going to put these things together? Where does it come from? These things are in each other's sort of zone of proximal engagement, and we can find the connections between them so we don't always have to express stuff. Thoughts have these penumbras. They interrelate with other thoughts. Some aspects are more strongly captured than others. So I think classical propositional representations can often be useful, but they only characterize thoughts approximately, right? They pick out the key entities and aspects of relations and so on in a way that we could notate and write down for our inspection and convenience. But I think the peril of symbolic cognition was to think that that was the representation as opposed to the tip of the iceberg of the representation. Another related idea is that I like to think of these as focal points in a vast web of interconnected representations of objects and relations, any of which could somehow emerge as a focal point and then become a thought. And it's sort of an emergent version of an explicit knowledge graph. So I said some of this already. A sentence is a way of communicating a piece of the knowledge web because we expect much of it to be shared, much of it goes unsaid. In writing and informal presentations, we strive to organize these pieces in a way that allows them to be built on each other effectively, but this always depends on context and background knowledge. And I personally think of internal language as always linked to internal thoughts that are not just language, but are strongly shaped by the culturally constructed tools of thought that include formally defined conceptual systems such as time, number, geometry, algebra, logic, programming languages, etc. So to think of time and number as culturally constructed is to think in a way that's a little different from a more nativist approach, but I think probably there's merits in both of these ways of thinking, and I think much of our intuition about things like number is actually shaped by experience rather than being given by any innate endowment. So I'm imagining that almost everyone in the room is asking themselves this question: aren't LLMs like GPT-4 operating at the level of thought? How many think yes? Not that many hands. How many think no? Oh, okay. Well, I'm preaching to the choir, I guess. But I don't know. I sometimes think that I'm wrong about this, and they're doing a pretty good job. So they certainly seem to be, right? Those outputs that we saw before were well-structured sequences of sentences, each describing what appears to be a cogent thought. Yet they do frequently make mistakes, as we've seen. I think they're very interesting in their failures because they often remind me of my own limitations. I can easily think that something is a solution to a problem without it actually being correct, just like GPT-4 did with X's. And like the people who thought that airplanes would never fly and neural networks would never be able to be useful for intelligence, I could be strongly committed to my belief to the contrary. So maybe they're like us, and we should strive to find ways to make them more like the best of us as best we can, or the way we like to be when we're getting it right, being like Einstein or Newton or Darwin or something. So here are two themes that I have for the future development of more performant model intelligence systems. One is to give them better grounding by integrating multiple modalities. And the second is to make them more intrinsically goal-directed. And I'm going to talk about these themes a little bit in my remaining few minutes here. And I'm going to use an example from mathematical cognition that I've thought about a lot. So if you ask a Stanford undergraduate who took a course in high school where they learned about trigonometric functions, what's the cosine of minus theta? They'll often tell you it's minus the cosine of theta. And if you give them a two alternative forced choice, between minus cosine of theta and just cosine of theta, 75% of them will get it wrong. That is to say, the cosine of minus theta is actually equal to the cosine of theta. But it's very confusing, right? Because the sine of minus theta is minus the sine of theta. And everybody gets that one right. And what does it mean, though, to really understand this expression and avoid making this mistake? Maybe this mistake is a kind of a superficial one that all of us are sort of prey to because we tend to be superficial processors and we tend to think, oh, when you multiply something times something in parentheses, you could pull out the minus sign, so why can't I do that here? I mean, you don't need to think this out loud. This may be some sort of like habit-like thing where it just seems like that's got to be the thing to do. So unthinkingly, we say that's got to be the right answer. But we can represent these expressions in terms of a model and see in our mind's eye that indeed the cosine of minus theta is equal to the cosine of theta. In order to do that, though, you need this model system. This is one of several model systems that will suffice for this, but it's the one that the people who get this question right tell us they're using, and that is to visualize angles as points on a unit circle that you reach by rotating in one or the other of two directions, starting from the positive x-axis. And then the cosine is the x-coordinate of that point, or its projection onto the x-axis. And visualizing it in that way, you sort of somehow seeing the circle as symmetric, even though when the professor draws it on the board, it's really just some sort of wobbly shaped oval that isn't really a circle, and the symmetry doesn't really apply. You nevertheless sort of appreciate that the point that you reach by rotating in the one direction is going to have the same x-coordinate as the point that you reach by rotating the same amount in the other direction. And on the other hand, since that's the x-coordinate, that's true about the cosine, but for the sine, it's the y-coordinate. And so in that case, the points are the same distance from the origin, but in the opposite direction, in the vertical direction. So by appreciating systems of thought that were created by mathematicians, like the unit circle. It's not the equations, it's the unit circle that they created. You learn how to think in accurate and explicitly correct ways, and grounding in these systems is, I think, a very important part of becoming a successful thinker. So nowadays, many people think that a lot of the accomplishments of GPT-4 have a lot to do with the fact that they were actually trained on two things: computer programs, which are highly structured reasoning systems, and textbooks that involve a lot of explanation and breaking problems down into parts, just like in that calculus problem that we saw. So they kind of learned the template for that, perhaps, and all of that. But in some sense, they are moving in the direction of having some of these kinds of systems. They don't have systems that can visualize like this, can actually connect with diagrams yet. This is one of the things that I try to promote in my consulting role at DeepMind, is to getting more engagement with actually getting these systems to be able to read diagrams properly and see them the way humans do. Exactly what that is, I'm not sure, but that's something we're working on. So I also like to think of these things in terms of what I call an integrated understanding system in the human brain. And here I'm going to try to connect a bit with my understanding of the actual neural basis of human cognition. This is a very schematic diagram that I constructed with some colleagues to fit into a paper, but I hope it resonates a little bit, and it certainly, to me, represents a parallel distributed processing system in that all the arrows are bidirectional. But what I've done is I've tried to represent the neocortex in blue, and I'm imagining somebody looking at a picture and hearing some language input at the same time, and forming representations driven both by the visual and the auditory input that are mutually constraining each other between the language and the object representations, and then also exploiting representations of a broader context. And all of these ovals that I've drawn here can be broadly linked to particular areas of the brain, and you guys can chat with me at the party this evening or other times if you like to find out where I think these things are or what other people have thought about where they might be. Those 5 modules there are actually things that I could sort of point to a little in some ways in the human brain. Obviously, they overlap and they interact. I would first say that, but they are in some ways dissociable, and lesions can dissociate them. So I sort of imagine that within each of these modules, the object module, the language module, and the context module, we have this little BERT-like process going on where all the objects are mutually constraining each other, and the words in the sentence are mutually constraining each other, and they're mutually constraining each other across between the objects in the language to set up a representation of this situation that isn't strictly just objects and isn't strictly just language, but it's both. And then this in turn results in some sort of contextualized representation that becomes part of a larger contextual event level representation or paragraph level representation where several ideas are compressed down into some sort of integrated, maybe multi-thought-like representation. And there's actually this very beautiful piece of work that Chris Baldessano was involved in where he and others showed that at the end of an event segment of a little movie, you sort of have this moment of coherent interaction between these parts of the brain I'm labeling context, which are up here, and the medial temporal lobe, as though you are storing this state, this sort of integrated representation of this contextualized event in some sort of rememberable thought-like unit in the medial temporal lobe. So the red part's supposed to be the medial temporal lobe, and it's supposed to be a fast learning system that allows us to access the contents of these thought-like units that we've stored away in our medial temporal lobe after having some experience listening and seeing and thinking, or maybe even interacting with the unit circle and having someone point out that the position you reach by rotating upwards, the x-coordinate is the same as the position you reach by rotating downwards. So that was one theme, multimodality and integration. And it also brings in memory, which I think everybody in deep learning, knows that just the transformer by itself is not the right way to think about things. You need some sort of external memory. Many different variations of that are being thought about, and that's certainly part of the future of these systems, even the present. But I want to talk about being goal-directed for the last 5 minutes. So I actually have more material than I'm going to cover here in my last 5 minutes, but I do want to just get this slide across and maybe one of the examples, and then I'll stop and take questions because I don't want to go over. So I'm offering the idea to you all, to myself, that it's useful to view humans as intrinsically goal-directed and to view goals as special types of thoughts. They're specifications of characteristics of desired future states. So I wanted to be in this room 20 minutes before my talk time started, right? That was a specification that I had, and it guided my behavior. Seemed like it was guiding it very explicitly. I was checking, can I fiddle with this one more slide, or should I leave now, to get there on time? I think that all the great achievements in science and technology have occurred through goal-directed efforts. I think Darwin and Newton and Einstein and Rumelhart were all sitting there trying to figure out how to solve a particular problem, and they spent a lot of time on it, and it didn't happen in one go. And they developed new ways of thinking to help them along the way. Certainly in Newton's case, that's so clear, right? Individually and in groups, we can be collectively goal-directed, and, we use language to exhort ourselves and each other to take on specific goals. And we organize our thoughts in service of achieving these goals explicitly. And that's not the way our models are learning. They're learning by getting gradient signals from next state predictions, and they're learning by getting reward signals. And I think that we need to think instead about rewards as inputs that satisfy or signify future satisfaction of internally specified goals. So giving me something to eat when I'm not hungry is not a reward. Giving me the answer to a problem I'm not trying to solve is likewise not helpful. But there are other things that are, and they help me meet my goals. And being more intrinsically goal-directed is something that production systems were, and which I hope our artificial systems will become. So I'm just going to give you this little task that we can teach ourselves to perform, given a language-based specification of the goal situation. You see here on the left a 10 by 10 grid with several regions highlighted in black. And you see the instruction: place 2 X's in each row, column, and bounded region in the grid. No 2 X's can be adjacent, not even diagonally. Now, when I've shown this to audiences before, I've asked, can anybody tell me where they can place X's right away? Where would you place it? Of the 3 guy over there on the 3rd column. Yeah. Why? Very good. Perfect. Okay, so we're thinking at the level of thought here, right? And all you need is this instruction, and you can do this task. I mean, not everyone sees it as quickly as everyone else, obviously, but someone in an audience, every audience I've tried this with, sees that first one. Let me suggest some other things about this. If you can find a bounded region that's exclusively in a single row or column, like the one on the left edge, which has 4 spaces in it, you can't tell where the X's have to go, but you know that none of the other cells in that column could have X's in them. And then the next thing I could tell you is that you'll be well on your way to solving this problem if you just adopt the sub-goal of figuring out where x's cannot go, because that will gradually help you gain more and more constraints that will make it clear where the x's have to go. Okay, so I've communicated to you, we've communicated to each other, you've discovered for yourself 3 ideas that are essential to solving these kinds of puzzles. And you discover these because you've adopted the goal, and you're, okay, how can I solve this goal, right? How can I meet these constraints? How can I solve that problem? So I'm just going to highlight briefly 3 things that happened here. We specified the task itself using a language-based statement like the one you see here, specifying the goal and relevant constraints. I gave you some general rules that you can seek matching conditions for, and like the bounded region that's contained entirely within a row or column. And I identified a sub-goal state that is desirable to achieve or to work towards then making this the goal of what you're doing. So you're not looking at places to put x's, you're looking at places where x's cannot go. And that's a very different thing to be looking for. But you're guiding your thoughts by that goal now when you adopt that suggestion. So these are features of production systems our neural network models would do well to emulate. Okay, so I was going to tell you a few more things, but I don't have any more time, and so I'm just going to say a student of mine has been working on contrasting human and neural network learning of a reasoning skill. And in brief, we've studied this in Sudoku, but it's very similar to Do Not Touch. And in brief, humans can learn a strategy and apply it, generalize it virtually perfectly in a very small number of trials. But if the strategy is a bit complex, not everybody learns it immediately from instruction. And I do think that there is a set of cognitive abilities that are perhaps mostly acquired, but maybe also influenced by individual difference variables that contribute to our ability to control our cognition. I think these are fascinating topics that need to be explored further to understand how to build better goal-directed systems and how to help ourselves be more goal-directed going forward. So let me skip over some slides and just say this. In sum, I think we still have a long way to go, and I'm just going to end with some highlights of my thoughts on what might be the path towards a solution. I would start with intrinsically self-directed agents that seek to satisfy their own goals. I would raise them in multimodal environments where they're continually interacting through language with other agents who they collaborate with to achieve goals, their own, the others, or shared goals that they have together. I would send them to schools where they learn structured modes of thinking, including the ability to rely on abstract relational reasoning of the kind that underlies mathematics, logic, Sudoku, and other forms of technical and scientific reasoning. I would expect them to become self-directed learners rather than slaves to an externally defined loss or reward signal. And I would imagine they would form compressed learned representations that are thought-sized chunks, and they would store them as such in an episodic memory system so that they can be retrieved and hopefully composed with each other to support novel problem-solving tasks without producing catastrophic interference. Okay, so I just want to say thanks to Rummelhart, Hinton, and the rest of the PDP group that launched me on this journey, and to all of my many subsequent students and collaborators at Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, DeepMind, and elsewhere. And to Nico, Chris, Layla, the other Nico, and Nick, and the other organizers for inviting me and making my pathway to this podium easy and clear. And thank you all for listening.
All right, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking talk. We now are happy to take questions either on Dory or if people want to come up to the mic in the room. Now's the time.
Hi, extremely thought-provoking. Thank you. I have a question in two versions. The provocative version is, what is thought in non-human animals? And I guess the deeper question is human cognition fundamentally different from that of other animals?
Yes and no. You know, many people point to language as something that humans do not share with other animals as being the uniquely important evolutionary difference. But I'm sort of more of a student of the view that we should notice that the difference between ourselves and our most closely related primate relatives can be found in all of the lobes of the brain, perhaps less in the occipital lobe than others, but certainly in the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. And they are not exclusively related to language. I think they're I'm going to say this, I hope you laugh, but it's a lot like the difference between the really small versions of GPT-3 and the really, really big ones. Oh, she's laughing, good. But it's, in a way, there's some possible truth to this, right? And people are seeing that certain kinds of things don't start to work until the models get really big. And it's not because they have a particular module that something else doesn't have. It's because they have somehow that extra scale is giving them something that wasn't available at a smaller scale. So obviously that's not the whole answer. There's definitely aspects of brain representations that are structured by evolutionary processes that are profoundly useful, and there may well be things that arose in primates and then in proto-humans that we don't share with others that I am not sure about, but I just want to not leave the possibility off the table that much of it comes from the elaboration of cortical brain areas through a developmental process that largely occurs through the increasing numbers of replication cycles that occur in an organism that gestates for a long time compared to one that gestates for less.
Right, over there. Question?
Hi.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So my question lies more on the developmental side. And I was just wondering about the type of goal-directed behavior that you were talking about. Sorry, I'm not tall enough for this. So basically, how we learn might be slightly different because we basically, as humans, we're in a naturalistic setting. We interact with people, we walk around, and a lot of our learning comes from that type of interaction with others, learning from others. And do you think our simulated environments, like to what degree are we able to really capture that actual naturalistic goal-directed behavior? And if we are not, then would you say that we might be limited by our hardware for creating embodied intelligence, which would actually walk around as we do and learn that way?
Yeah, it's a great question, but I guess the way I think about it is that if we could create sort of humanoid robots that actually had the mechanical capabilities of human physical bodies and human articulatory systems and human sensory systems, in compact sort of, you know, little agents that could roam around in the real world and interact with each other, that would really be awesome. And I think, you know, the other way of saying this in part is that it's our ability to simulate the environment that's one of the limiting steps. So this is really a huge limitation in a lot of the work that people are trying to do at DeepMind, and it's one of the places where, you know, a huge amount of investment goes into actually creating the simulated environment. It's not so much the neural network itself as the environment that the network interacts with that becomes the kind of the experience limiting factor in driving these things. Yeah, I often think, you know, that we need to be able to have experiences like I have when I'm sitting in the playroom with my 2 grandchildren and we're manipulating Lego blocks or something like that, and we're talking to each other and socially engaged, and anything that any one of us does, the other of us can see, you know, and so we are sort of mutually constraining each other's learning, and I think that that's part of what you're asking about, and I think that's part of the solution.
All right, final question with the request to keep it brief because we're already in the break time.
Okay, I'll do my best. My question wasn't designed to be brief, but it seems like the primary difference between artificial intelligence, as we've seen represented in language models, and human-type intelligence is this concept of modularity, in which human intelligence, the brain has many different aspects and systems that are constantly talking to each other, and it's the interaction of those reasonings that are allowing human-level intelligence to really exist. And I'm curious what form you think the modularity will play in the development of AI going forward. To give an example, you mentioned that GPT-4 doesn't have the ability to process images, but recently we've seen things like Code Interpreter, an extension of GPT-4 that can generate very advanced visualizations that contain a lot of reasoning information in them. And whether or not it can interpret those back, we have other systems built on visual transformers that can interpret the reasoning between 2 objects in a frame and what that means. And so it seems to me that we have systems that can do a lot of these different aspects, and connecting them together is really a big part of what's limiting these systems from continuing to advance towards human-level intelligence. And so I'm curious what role you think modularity and integration has to play in allowing AI systems to approach human level.
It's a great question, and I appreciate that you've introduced detail that I didn't cover myself, and that I may not even be fully up to date on in all respects. But I like the emphasis that you place in the question on how to understand how these things integrate with each other. And you know, it's certainly my view that they mutually constrain each other in not just processing, but in providing the teaching signals that allow them to learn how to process. And so I certainly don't think it ultimately makes sense to imagine them being sort of like separately trained units that just talk to each other or anything like that. Yes. So modularity, of course, is really an interesting topic in cognitive neuroscience. And, you know, like many, I think that there are parts of the brain that tend to be disposed to certain functions by virtue of partly their connectivity and partly their cytoarchitecture, and maybe even their certain signals that propagate to them that don't propagate to other parts of the brain. But to the extent that they all can be coordinated in the service of goals, I think that that's going to turn out to be very important. So I'm not sure that I've added anything beyond what was in the question itself, but those are the kinds of thoughts that I have.
Thanks for a great talk.
All right, thanks.